In note 7.4, we're going to be talking about molecular formulas. If you recall, when we talked about empirical formulas gave us the lowest whole number ratio of the atoms in a compound. Okay, a molecular formula is different because a molecular formula is going to give us the actual formula of the molecule. For ionic compounds, the molecular and the empirical formulas are the same. However, for molecular compounds, the molecular formula can be something different than that of the empirical formula. So the molecular formula is going to tell us the exact number of each type of atoms in a molecule instead of reducing it to just the lowest ratio. Okay, for a molecular formula, you should know that the molecular formula can either be the same as the empirical formula or it's going to be some simple whole number multiple of it. Okay, and to determine the molecular formula for a compound or a molecule, you would need to have both the empirical formula and the molecular weight of the molecule. Okay, so if you have the empirical formula, you know what the mass of the molecule is that you're working with, you can determine the molecular formula. The steps to determining the molecular formula, you are going to divide the molecular weight of the molecule by the mass of the empirical formula of the compound to get what we call the multiplier. And you will then multiply the empirical formula by the multiplier in order to get that molecular formula. If your multiplier ends up being 1, then your empirical formula and your molecular formula are the same. However, if the multiplier is something else, then you are going to end up with a different molecular formula than empirical formula. Okay, so an example of how we might use this, let's say we want to find the molecular formula of a compound whose molecular weight is 60 grams and whose empirical formula is CH4N. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to take that empirical formula and we're going to determine the mass or the mole weight of that empirical formula. So if we use the periodic table and we look up the mole weights for CH4 and N, we end up with a mass of an empirical formula that's going to be 12 plus 1 times 4 plus 14. Okay, so again, those are the mole weights of carbon, 4 hydrogens, and a nitrogen. If I add this all together, then I end up with a weight of 30 grams per mole. Okay, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to take the mole weight that's given. Okay, so this is like in lab, this compound was synthesized and the weight of the compound was 60 grams. I'm going to take that weight that's given, 60, and divide it by the empirical formula weight, which was 30. Okay, when I divide these two numbers out, I end up with 2. Okay, this 2 is my multiplier then, and so I'm going to use this multiplier, and I'm going to multiply it times everything in my empirical formula in order to get the molecular formula. Okay, so again, where this 2 came from was from this 60, which was the weight of the compound that was given in the problem, divided by the mass of the empirical formula, which we calculated to be 30. If you ever forget which order that is, it is always going to be the bigger number divided by the smaller number. Okay, so now with this multiplier, I'm going to look back, and essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 2 and I'm going to distribute it to everything in my empirical formula. So this 2 gets distributed to the C, the H, and the N, and when it does, I end up with a molecular formula of C2, H8, N2. Okay, and again, this is the actual chemical formula for the compound. So if I were to look at this compound, I would see 2 carbons, 8 hydrogens, and 2 nitrogens. Okay, if I were to reduce that to the lowest ratio, then I would end up with my empirical formula, which is CH4N. So if you have the empirical formula and you have the mass, which will always be given to you, so this information here will be given to you, okay, you can determine the molecular formula of the compound. If the empirical formula is not given, then you would first need to calculate that in order to determine the mass of the empirical formula and then divide it out to find the multiplier to determine the molecular formula.